about a month and a half ago, I made the claim that these large language models that people were getting all up in arms about, like O3, O1, all of these things, were ultimately going to be commodities. Wasn't my idea. Many people have said it before, but it's definitely not the consensus in the AI and tech community. I just happened to think that that was going to be what it was like. The comparison that I made at that time was about the history of the personal computer and the way that these important processors, the processors that you have in your computer, in your laptop, in your phone today, are very similar to the position in the system that these large language models have right now in AI systems, in chatbot systems, in agents, and things like that. The release of DeepSeek's R1 model and all of the other versions of it show us that I think I was right. At least in the short term, it seems like that idea still holds, that for the most part, large language models will be considered commodities and will be priced as such. Now, if you're here, you've probably been watching other videos about this, and maybe you've done a little bit of reading about it. But in a 30-second summary, a Chinese AI company released a model that is open source, is cheaper, was cheaper to train, and has about the same performance as the leading AI model at OpenAI. Okay, that's the first part. The second part is that those models also have smaller versions which are achieving better performance than we've seen on a lot of other small models in the past. And the way that that happened was that the big model, the one that they have released, R1, has trained a bunch of smaller models like they are its student. That is what has happened. Now, the implications of that is that most people didn't notice it for a little while. And then over the last couple of days, people started to notice and markets started tanking and Nvidia stock went down and people started questioning what the future of American AI companies is going to be. People have called this AI's Sputnik moment. And while I think there are some truths to those, that the release of this model is significant, I don't think that the frenzy that it has stirred up is rational. I think it's quite emotional, is the way I would put it. And so what I thought I might do is go through each of the big sort of like American AI companies and how they might benefit or get hurt or change their strategy based off of an announcement like this. Starting from the top, with Meta. Now, Meta stands to benefit from this because they are not a cloud computing company. They make their money by selling ads and getting eyeballs. And their philosophy about AI is that instead of creators making content, AI will, and that they will be able to endlessly personalize this content to individual users, get them to come back more often, and therefore see more ads, which, by the way, will probably also be AI generated. And so what does a open source, cheap, performant AI model mean for them? Well, it means spending less money on making that content, and it means getting better quality content as a result. You'll note here that the other major open source model that has been released came out of Meta. In fact, Zuckerberg is probably the one tech executive that has made the case for open source AI the strongest, because when AI gets cheaper, so does their cost for the things that they do, and they just retain their position as a social media company, an algorithmic social media company. So Meta stands to benefit. Second one, Amazon. Amazon is an unusual one, in my opinion, because of the state of where it's at in the race right now. One of the things that people have said about Amazon is that they, like, for example, Apple, are behind in the AI race. And I think that that is mostly true, but I will say that Amazon executives have come out and have been some of the most vocal proponents of the case that these large language models are commodities. They actually were a big inspiration for that video that I posted about a month and a half ago. Of course, this is advantageous to them and their business because guess what? How Amazon makes money off of these models? By selling compute power through AWS. And so the more that these models get used, the more their compute usage goes up. Now, you might think that the nature of the technology is not in line with that because it's more efficient. So shouldn't it use less power? Well, there's this thing that people have been talking about, and it's this paradox called Jevons paradox, which is this old idea that comes from, I think, the 20th century, maybe even earlier, that says that when technology makes a resource use more efficient, that instead of the usage going down because of that efficiency, it at least stays the same and sometimes goes up because it's cheaper to use. And so what does that mean when something's cheaper to use? Suddenly, new paradigms are completely possible because of that. You might think of this as what happened with the personal computer, the internet and social media and the destruction of traditional media and the way that we do e-commerce. Those are all paradigms that would not have been possible if it had not gotten more efficient to use computing power. And it unlocked it increased the demand for computing power overall, and it also unlocked new paradigms that were possible because of that. And so I tend to think that if this, that their case of the future of LLMs is validated and that they will continue to benefit because of that. They position themselves to, and they will continue to benefit because of the increased computing. Number 3, tried and true for this channel, Apple. The implications for them have been much less discussed because they are much less direct than the other companies. Meta benefits from a lower cost, Amazon benefits from more usage. Apple doesn't benefit directly and isn't hurt directly in any type of way. They are not licensing models from anyone else. They are not selling models to anyone else. They are continuing to make iPhones and trying to build iPhones around these things. They're marketing their iPhones as Apple intelligence machines and things like that. So what is the implication of DeepSeek for them? Why am I even talking about them? Well, I think the research implications of the distilled models are what applies to Apple. Now, one of the things that people have said about Apple is that they're behind, right? They don't know how to train a model. They don't know what they're doing. But what they don't get credit for is how they've positioned themselves with their strategy and their system architecture in order to benefit from the AI wave. Now, the thing that was unclear to me last year when Apple announced Apple Intelligence was whether small large language models that would fit on a phone could come anywhere near the level of usefulness that large language models had on the server, right? Obviously very different sorts of efficiency and power envelopes between those two types of devices. It has seemed like there's been some level of edge usefulness for Apple to place these things. They've had a couple of scandals recently. They've changed certain things about the way that their phone processes this information. They've changed the UI. They've taken it out of beta. Actually, let me take that back. I think it's still in beta, but they've released it to the public. So for all intents and purposes, it's out of beta. These things all get improved with better models. And what DeepSeek has done is they've shown that small models can get a lot better by learning from big models. And that is a direct benefit to the strategy that Apple has taken with Apple Intelligence. These smaller models will get better a lot more quickly than a lot of people thought because of the ability for them to learn from the big teacher models that they may choose to train internally and keep proprietary in a very Apple fashion. And so I think that Apple has a indirect benefit because of the proof of concept that these small models will get more capable extremely quickly. Now to the juicy stuff, OpenAI. OpenAI is, I would say, in the middle, right? If Apple, Amazon, and Meta have all stand to gain, OpenAI stands to change their strategy. They've always been the most volatile of all these companies because they're the youngest. They're the startup of the group, right? So in terms of what they have to lose, well, what they have to lose is quite a bit, actually. A lot of people have perceived OpenAI as the frontier of the set of AI companies because they are. They have led the group in the capabilities of these models. But because this has served as further proof that LLMs are ultimately mostly commoditized, it makes those frontier models less valuable. So, if their frontier model isn't going to be an advantage, in my opinion, what does that mean for the rest of their company? Well, it clarifies their position as the accidental consumer company, as Ben Thompson has called it at Stratechery. Most of the mind share about AI, in my opinion, has gone to OpenAI about the company that does AI stuff or where to go to do AI stuff. If I ask my grandma or my mom about where I should go, where they might go for it, I would bet that they would think of ChatGPT. The danger here in relation to that is, first of all, whether they are focused on this or whether they want to continue being out on the front, or second of all, whether they've built enough of a moat in their operating system, as I called it in my O3 video, in order for their product to retain consumer perception as the brand that people should go to. Now, the thing that throws a wrench into this is whether these frontier models could get better so exponentially quickly that they just blow everything else away because the time advantage just is so great, even if it's a short amount of time, that the power of these models could improve almost more than exponentially. But I'm sort of skeptical of that. All right, for old time's sake, since it's getting cold and my tripod can't handle it, you get to be right here, getting cozy and personal. So OpenAI does have a bunch to lose, but they also have a lot to gain. In particular, one of the other recent announcements was this thing called Stargate. OpenAI is involved. It is a $500 billion, again, $500 billion investment in computing power. And it's sort of at a weird time when buying a bunch of these computer chips is a very quickly depreciating asset, but is also a relatively aggressive bet that they can get enough of a moat, A, on frontier models, and B, on the actual use of those frontier models, what people call inference, in order to stay ahead overall. And if that's the case, then they also stand to benefit from the increase in compute, even if they aren't that differentiated from the rest of their offerings like Amazon and other folks like that in terms of price and capability. And so OpenAI is murky waters. Microsoft, I talk about them after OpenAI because their future partially is tied up with OpenAI. They were an early bet on OpenAI as the sort of future of this AI revolution, and they have a strategic partnership with them that has them using Azure computers. Of course, that is mitigated with the Stargate thing that I talked about as well. But in the past like 6 months or so, it seems like they have distanced themselves from OpenAI in certain ways. But Microsoft does stand to benefit from increased compute in the same way that Amazon does, and in the same way that Stargate does. Because again, the more people that find applications for this technology, the more they will use computers to do it. And guess who owns a lot of computers? Microsoft. Very Microsoft of them. Penultimately, Google. This is where we get into the companies that are sort of in trouble. Actually, the company that I think is in most trouble. In fact, Google, I would say, is still in a code red. I remember, I think early last year, that there was this discussion, or maybe even earlier than that, about Google bringing all of the greatest minds in their company together and being like, this is an issue. This AI thing is an issue for us. Like, we stand a lot to lose. And I think that they were prescient with that. I think that they were right. They're facing consumer competition, first of all, from OpenAI, who released a search product recently, right? As well as other small companies that are inventing the next version of a search engine, which people have called a answer engine, right? And they're also going to receive competition that fundamentally disrupts their business model. Right now, Google makes money by selling ads against Google, right? There's no proven business model that can necessarily match that same level of revenue in the answer model sort of like version of the world. We haven't seen it yet. We don't know what that looks like. And so even if they chose to go the direction of their competitors, they would lose out on revenue in the short term that is their current cash cow of a business. And so they are in a classic innovator's dilemma. So they're in trouble on the search side. They're also in trouble on the part of the equation that I think that they actually have the most advantage in. So taking a step back, outside of search, their other big asset is Android, right? And in that, they have integrated distribution in the same way that Apple does. It's just that theirs with Android, and in particular Pixel, and they even have a little bit of an edge over Apple in their willingness to use server compute to do some of this stuff. Now, of course, they don't have as big of a distribution advantage as Apple does because there are more people with iPhones than with Pixel phones, but they have shown that they are willing to make steps in this direction of having that integrated stack and a distribution and using the distribution to their advantage there. But they haven't really made strides yet. And of course, it's still early, but we just haven't seen evidence of it yet. And so I can't say that it's good news for them necessarily. Now, if anything, since this video is about the DeepSeek model, I would say that it's a net negative, at least slightly, because the distillation idea that is encapsulated in this research shows that Apple's position of using as local as possible models is feasible, right? It is proven that to me, that it's feasible, and that gives Apple a little bit of an edge in this regard. That doesn't mean that Google can't use it, but it just means that Google's previous edge of being willing to use servers is not as clear anymore. So that brings us all the way home to maybe the biggest short-term loser, which was Nvidia, that saw a huge question about their level of success. And to me, the big brouhaha about the use of these Nvidia chips is the most emotional part of it all. I think that a lot of people have gotten up in arms about it because they thought, oh, well, maybe this is, bad news for them. But ultimately, these devices, no matter who's training them, a lot of their sort of value comes from their use. And as of right now, Nvidia is still in a good position there, right? Like, those computers are still going to get used, those chips are still going to get used. And so I haven't heard super compelling arguments about why they would be big losers in this. And so I think that they remain relatively the same. Of course, in the short term, efficiency might mean some level of drop, but I tend to believe in the idea that, a more efficient use of these resources might mean bigger use because of a paradigm shift later on, as we've seen in most economic sort of like major scenarios where we've had this type of behavior. And so, bottom line, the winners, I think, very clearly are Meta, Amazon, and Apple. The big question marks are OpenAI and Microsoft. The big loser is Google. And I think, again, there's that phrase that, the way to get rich in a gold rush is to sell picks and shovels to the miners. And I think Nvidia is pretty good at selling picks and shovels. So I don't see much of a downside for them.